the question that wouldn't leave me alone. I used to believe that my father and I lived in two different worlds, parallel lines that would never quite meet. He was a white man from a small town in Ohio, a man of few words, a man who wore silence like armor. I was his daughter, a young black woman trying to carve out my place in a world that constantly asked me to explain who I was and where I fit. Our lives touched in practical ways: holiday dinners, brief phone calls, the occasional hug that felt stiff, as though neither of us knew how long to hold on. But deeper conversations, they almost never happened. And maybe that was why the question haunted me. What if I asked him something he couldn't avoid with a shrug or a "you'll understand when you're older"? What if one question could finally make him see me, not just as his daughter, but as a woman with scars, with fears, with stories he'd never heard? It was a Sunday afternoon when the idea took root. I was sitting at my apartment desk, laptop open, but I couldn't focus on work. My mind kept circling back to a statistic I'd read. Nearly 60% of adult children in the U.S. admit they struggle to have meaningful conversations with their fathers. I wasn't surprised. I was part of that 60%. Growing up, I wanted to ask him about love, about fear, about the nights he couldn't sleep. But each time I opened my mouth, the words withered under his silence. Sometimes silence is louder than shouting. The memories replayed in fragments. I remembered being 8 years old, walking home from school after a kid on the playground asked, "Why's your skin darker than your dad's?" I ran straight to him, clutching my little backpack, asking, "Daddy, why don't we look the same?" He smiled, ruffled my curls, and said, "You look perfect. That's all that matters." But the answer never went deeper than that. At 13, when a teacher assumed my mother must be the help, I wanted to ask him how to carry the sting of being misseen. Instead, I swallowed the hurt because he never asked if I was okay. And at 21, when my first boyfriend broke my heart, I wanted to ask him if he had ever loved someone so much it left a mark. Instead, I cried in my room, too afraid of the blank expression he might give me. The truth was, my father was a mystery to me, not just as a parent, but as a man. I knew his favorite beer. I knew he liked football on Sundays and that he fell asleep halfway through most movies. I knew the scar on his chin came from a bicycle crash when he was 10. But the real things, his regrets, his fears, his choices, those lived behind locked doors, and I had spent my whole life staring at those doors, wondering if I was ever allowed to knock. That night, I sat on my bed staring at the ceiling. The question burned like fire in my chest. What's the one thing you've never told me, but always wanted to? I imagined his possible answers. Maybe he would tell me about his first love. Maybe he would admit he'd made mistakes, ones he hoped I'd never repeat. Or maybe, just maybe, he would tell me something that would change the way I saw him forever. But a darker thought crept in. What if he refused to answer at all? What if the silence I had always known was the only answer I would ever get? The following week, I called him. His voice on the phone was steady, flat, like always. "Hey, Dad, can we meet up this weekend? Just the two of us?" There was a pause, long enough to make me second guess. "Sure," he said finally. "Where?" "Your place, Sunday." I didn't tell him what I planned. I didn't tell him that my heart had already started rehearsing the question, rolling it around in my chest until the words felt both sharp and fragile. When Sunday came, I drove to his house, a modest 2-story on the edge of town. The same house I'd grown up in, where the walls still carried echoes of my childhood laughter and my mother's voice calling us to dinner. I stepped inside, greeted by the faint smell of coffee and wood polish. The living room hadn't changed. The recliner still sat by the window, the same spot where he read the newspaper every morning. He gave me a quick hug, then motioned toward the couch. We sat an arm's length apart. The silence stretched, like always. "How's work?" he asked. "It's fine," I replied. "Busy." He nodded, his eyes already drifting toward the muted television. The small talk was suffocating. My chest tightened. I hadn't come here for small talk. I studied him. The lines on his face deeper now, his hair more salt than pepper. Time had moved forward, but our conversations hadn't. My palms grew sweaty. My throat ached with unspoken words. Finally, I leaned forward, my voice trembling, but determined. "Dad," I whispered, "can I ask you something?" His eyes flicked to mine. For the first time in years, they didn't look past me. They looked into me. The room felt smaller, heavier. "One question," I said, "but it might change everything." His brow furrowed, but he didn't speak. I inhaled deeply, my heart racing, and just as I opened my mouth to say it, the words trembled on my lips, heavy and dangerous, like glass that could shatter if spoken too loudly. I swallowed, staring at my father across the living room. His eyes were fixed on me, cautious, curious, like he was trying to read a language he'd never learned. "Dad," I began again, my voice breaking slightly. "What's the one thing you've never told me, but always wanted to?" For a heartbeat, nothing. Then his gaze flickered, and something passed across his face. So quick, I almost missed it. Fear. He leaned back in his chair, fingers gripping the armrest. "That's a strange question," he muttered, his voice low. "It's not strange," I said, pressing forward. "It's important. I've spent my whole life wondering who you really are, wondering what's behind all the silence. I need to know." The air in the room thickened. My father's silence was louder than the ticking clock on the wall. He rubbed his jaw, the way he always did when he was stalling. "Why now?" he finally asked. "Because," I whispered, "I'm tired of guessing. I don't just want to know you as Dad. I want to know you as a man." His eyes darkened. For a moment, I thought he might laugh it off, change the subject like always. But instead, he stood and walked toward the window, staring out at the yard as if the bare trees could give him courage. "I don't know if you're ready for that," he said. Those words pierced me. Not ready? I was 27 years old. I had weathered heartbreak, racism, and nights crying into my pillow without telling anyone. How could he think I wasn't ready? "Try me," I said, my voice firmer now. He stayed at the window, back turned to me. The silence stretched on so long, I thought he wouldn't answer at all. My chest tightened, frustration mixing with fear. And then, softly, he spoke. "When I was your age, I made choices that still haunt me, choices that shaped who I became as a father and as a man. I leaned forward, gripping the couch cushion. "What choices?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You wouldn't understand." The anger rose in me, hot and uncontrollable. "Wouldn't understand?" I snapped. "Do you have any idea how many years I've tried to understand you? You sit in silence, hiding behind half answers. And I'm just supposed to accept that?" "No, Dad, not this time." My voice cracked, and I felt tears pressing against my eyes. "I need you to stop protecting me from the truth. You've spent my whole life hiding it, and it's killing whatever's left between us." He turned then, his face pale, eyes glistening in a way I'd never seen before. For the first time, my father looked vulnerable, human. "I'm not protecting you," he said quietly. "I'm protecting myself." The confession stole my breath. "What do you mean?" I whispered. He sank back into his recliner, shoulders sagging under a weight I couldn't see. His hands trembled as he clasped them together. "There are things about me," he said slowly, "that don't fit with the man you think I am. Things I've buried because I didn't want you to see me differently. I didn't want you to see my failures." My heart pounded. "Dad, I don't care about perfect. I care about real." He shook his head. "Real isn't always what you want." The room fell into a suffocating quiet. I stared at him, trying to piece together the puzzle of this man who had raised me yet remained a stranger. I thought about all the times I'd needed his words and gotten silence instead. Maybe the silence wasn't for me, it was for him. Maybe he'd been building a wall not to keep me out, but to keep his own pain in. I wiped my tears and steadied my voice. "Then let me in, please. Whatever it is, I'd rather know the truth than live with questions." He looked at me for a long time, his eyes red at the edges, his lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, he whispered, "If I tell you, you may never see me the same way again." I sat up straighter. "Then at least I'll see you. Really see you." Something cracked inside him then. I could hear it in the way his breath hitched. He ran a hand through his graying hair, his body trembling like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, terrified to jump. I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "Dad, please, what is it?" His lips parted. He started to speak, then stopped. For the first time in my life, I saw my father cry, just one tear running down the lines of his weathered face. I froze, afraid to breathe, afraid to break the fragile moment. Finally, in a voice so faint I almost didn't hear it, he said, "There's something you don't know about me. Something I should have told you years ago." He closed his eyes, as if bracing for impact, and then he said the words that shattered everything I thought I knew. The words hung in the air like a storm about to break. I sat frozen on the couch, my father's tear-streaked face locked in my memory. This was it, the moment I'd been chasing my whole life, the moment when the silence would finally crack open. "There's something you don't know about me," he whispered again, voice shaking. My pulse thundered in my ears. "Then tell me," I urged. "Please." He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as if the weight of decades pressed against his ribs. When I was your age, I turned my back on someone I loved. And I've regretted it every single day since. My throat went dry. Who? He looked at me then, and the sorrow in his eyes cut through me. Your mother. I blinked, confused. What do you mean? You and Mom? We were never the love story you thought you were, he interrupted, his voice rough. I met her at a time when I was too afraid to admit who I really was, too afraid of what people would think of me. Loving a black woman in a small Ohio town in the early 90s, it wasn't just frowned upon, it was condemned. And instead of standing tall, instead of protecting her, I hid. My chest tightened. I had always known their marriage had cracks, but hearing this shook me. She carried the weight of stares, of whispers, of rejection from neighbors, even from my own family, he continued, tears brimming. And I let her carry it alone. I stayed silent because I thought silence would keep us safe. But silence, his voice broke, destroyed us. I swallowed hard, the pieces of my childhood reframing themselves. The cold looks from strangers at the grocery store. The way Mom's smile sometimes faltered when Dad pretended not to notice the slurs muttered under his breath. The countless dinners where conversation died in the air. You never defended her, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. His face crumpled. I was a coward. I thought I was protecting our family by keeping my head down, by not making waves. But all I did was teach you and your mother that I was too afraid to fight for you. I stared at him, anger and grief twisting together inside me. All these years, I whispered, you let me believe the distance was my fault, that you just didn't care enough to know me. But really, it was guilt. You couldn't look me in the eye because I remind you of her, of what you did. His silence was answer enough. Tears blurred my vision, spilling hot and unrelenting down my cheeks. I wanted to scream, to run, to undo the years of silence that had carved a canyon between us. But instead, I just sat there, trembling. Why didn't you ever tell me? I demanded. Why did you let me grow up thinking you didn't want to talk when really you couldn't face your own shame? He buried his face in his hands. Because I thought if I pretended long enough, maybe I could be the father you deserved. But the truth doesn't stay buried. It seeps out in every word you don't say, every hug you pull away from, every conversation you never have. I was never silent because of you. I was silent because of me. The admission cut deep, but in a strange way, it also explained everything. I thought back to the nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering why my father seemed so far away. I thought of the questions I never asked because I feared the emptiness of his answers. And now I understood. The distance wasn't rejection. It was guilt. For the first time in years, I didn't see him as untouchable, unreachable. I saw him as a man haunted by his own failures, crushed by his silence. And strangely, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected. Compassion. I wiped my face, my voice trembling. You can't change the past, Dad, but you can change what happens now. You can't undo what you didn't say to Mom, but you can say it to me. He looked up, eyes bloodshot, face lined with regret. What if I don't know how? Then learn, I said firmly, with me. We sat there in the stillness, years of unspoken words hanging heavy between us. Then, slowly, cautiously, he reached across the space that had always divided us. His hand hovered, unsure, before finally landing on mine. It wasn't a perfect gesture. It wasn't enough to erase the pain, but it was something. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking, "for all the words I never gave you, for all the times I chose silence when you needed sound. I can't promise I'll be good at this, but I want to try." A lump rose in my throat. For so long I had dreamed of hearing him say something, anything, that acknowledged the chasm between us. And now he finally had. I squeezed his hand, my tears softening. "That's all I ever wanted, for you to try." We sat there in fragile quiet, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the suffocating kind, not the wall-building kind. This silence was alive. Later that night, when I drove home, the question replayed in my mind. "What's the one thing you've never told me, but always wanted to?" It had cracked open a truth I hadn't expected, one that hurt and healed in equal measure. The past couldn't be rewritten. My father's silence had left scars that would never fully fade. But maybe, just maybe, the future could hold something different. Because sometimes, one question doesn't just change the way you see your father. Sometimes, it changes the way you see yourself. The night I asked my father that life-changing question didn't end with fireworks or instant healing. There were no perfect words, no sudden transformation that erased years of silence. But something shifted. I realized that the man I had been searching for wasn't lost. He was buried under his own regrets. And when he finally let me see him, flawed and human, I stopped waiting for a perfect father and started learning how to love the one I had. Our story is still being written. Some days we stumble back into silence. Other days we find the courage to talk. But every time I hear his voice crack with honesty, every time I feel him trying, I know the question was worth asking. Because the truth is, one question doesn't just change your relationship with your father. Sometimes it changes the way you see yourself and the way you carry your own silence.
Your like and subscribe means a lot. It helps me keep bringing you stories that matter.